The work itself was ordinary, in the way important work often was. A number on one sheet did not match a number on another. A delivery marked complete had arrived with 2 items short. My job was to find the gap, identify who could correct it, and make sure the correction did not create a second problem somewhere else. I liked that kind of work. It rewarded attention without asking for a performance. No one cared whether I was impressive while I did it. They cared whether the right thing arrived at the right place, and whether the record could prove it. My family had always treated that part of me as useful until it became inconvenient. At home, being the person who noticed the wrong number meant being asked to fix it. It did not mean being invited to question why the number was wrong. If Evan spent more than he had, I was supposed to explain the budget. If David promised a deadline he had not checked, I was supposed to make the schedule work. If Helen forgot a bill, I was supposed to call the company and sound pleasant. I had learned to separate the job from the reward. The job was mine. The reward, when one existed, went to Evan. At 3:17 in the morning, my phone vibrated against the metal edge of the desk. I was still wearing my duty vest. The room was small, overheated, and bright enough to make everyone look tired. A printer clicked somewhere behind me. 2 people were talking over a spreadsheet on the other side of the partition. I had been checking a shipment discrepancy for the 3rd time when the phone found a signal and began downloading everything it had missed. The first alert said, "Outgoing ACH, $28,000. The second arrived before I could finish reading the first. Outgoing ACH, $17,500. Then the third. Outgoing ACH, $16,340. All 3 came from the account I had named Canyon Reserve, the account that held the money I had saved for a home after I came back. The first payment went to a venue. The second went to a planning and catering company. The third was labeled with a vendor code I didn't recognize. I added the numbers in my head, then opened the calculator because my brain refused to trust itself. 28,000, 17,500, 16,340, $61,840. The balance that had been $68,000 was now $6,160. For a few seconds I tried to make the numbers ordinary. Maybe the alerts were duplicated. Maybe the vendor code belonged to a legitimate property company I had forgotten. Maybe the account history had loaded the wrong profile because the connection was unstable. Those were reasonable checks. They were also the last comfortable explanations available to me. I opened the detail for the $28,000 payment. The recipient name contained the word venue. The detail for $17,500 contained planner and catering. The third line showed a pending ACH bundle with a vendor code that matched the wedding documents I had seen in Evan's messages months earlier. The account had not been drained by a mysterious system error. It had been used to make a plan possible. I wrote the transaction dates in the margin of the shipment sheet in front of me. The first payment had gone out on a Thursday. The second had followed on Monday. The third had been initiated that morning. The sequence was not one accidental click. Someone had watched the wedding calendar and moved money as each commitment came due. That was the moment the physical exhaustion caught up with me. My hands began to shake, not dramatically, just enough that I had to put the phone on the desk. I stood and walked to the water dispenser. The room kept doing its job around me. A printer finished a page. Someone asked for a signature. A door opened and closed. I wanted the world to acknowledge that something enormous had happened. Instead, the next person asked whether the discrepancy on the shipment sheet had been resolved. "Not yet," I said. The answer sounded like it belonged to the work in front of me. In a way, it did. I could not fix the account from that room by feeling more intensely. I could preserve the alerts, record the balance, and stop the next transfer if I was still in time. I took screenshots before refreshing the page. I emailed them to my personal address. Then I wrote one sentence in the Notes app. 3 wedding-related transfers from Canyon Reserve during deployment. Total $61,840. Verify authority before responding. The last 2 words kept me from calling my mother immediately. Verify authority. Not because I doubted the balance, but because I needed to know what she had been allowed to do, and what she had decided to do anyway. I opened the account history and scrolled backward. The deposits were ordinary. A transfer from my operating account after a promotion, a tax refund, a bonus from a project that had ended early, automatic contributions that had continued while I was busy with training and paperwork. There was no inheritance hidden in the balance, and no family money mixed into it. Every dollar had arrived through a decision I had made, and left through one I had not. That mattered because my parents had always used the phrase family money, as if the word family changed the origin of a deposit. David had called my first deployment bonus a family windfall, because I had spent part of it helping Evan replace a damaged camera. Helen had called the money in my savings extra, because I did not have children, and Evan did. I had stopped arguing about the word extra years earlier. There was no extra money. There was money assigned to something, and money not yet assigned. The Canyon Reserve balance had been assigned. The account history made the 3 transfers look even less accidental. The venue payment had appeared 11 days earlier. The planner payment had appeared 6 days after that. The final bundle had been initiated on the morning Helen sent me the message asking me not to interfere. I wrote the dates under the amounts. The sequence looked like a hand moving across a calendar. First make the promise, then use the money. Then ask her not to stop the next one. For several seconds I stared at the screen without breathing properly. It wasn't the amount alone. It was the combination of names. A venue, a planner, a vendor bundle. There was only one event in my family large enough to explain that pattern, and I had not agreed to pay for it. My brother's wedding was still 7 months away. That fact was the first thing that kept me from calling my mother. If the wedding had been tomorrow, I might have reacted before I understood what had happened. But 7 months gave the transfers a shape. This wasn't a last-minute emergency. It was a decision someone had made weeks earlier, maybe months earlier, while I was far enough away to be treated like an obstacle instead of a person. I opened the other account. Rent was covered. The insurance payment scheduled for the next week was covered. The small monthly transfer I used for phone service and personal expenses was still there. My operating account had not been touched. I sat back in the chair. That mattered. I wasn't stranded. No one had emptied the money I needed to function. They had taken the money I had told them was for my future. I took screenshots of every alert. I captured the account history, the available balance, and the payment descriptions. Then I emailed the screenshots to an address I used for personal records. I did not send them to my mother. I did not send them to my brother. I did not type a single accusation. My phone vibrated again. This time it was a message from Helen. Don't make Evan's wedding about money. We'll explain when you're back. I read it twice. The sentence was so familiar that it almost made me laugh. Whenever my family wanted something from me, they first tried to rename the thing I was objecting to. Money became love. A boundary became selfishness. A question became an attack. Another message appeared. Please don't interfere with the next vendor charge. It's the last one we need to keep everything on schedule. I looked back at the third transfer. The $16,340 payment was already showing against my available balance, but the bank marked it as pending. It had not fully settled. That was the first piece of luck I had seen since the alerts arrived. I put the phone face down. There were people around me who needed me to finish the work on my desk. I had spent years learning that panic was not the same as urgency. Panic made you send the wrong email, call the wrong person, or give someone a sentence they could use against you later. Urgency made you write down the sequence. I opened a blank note and typed 317, 3 transfers. Under it, I wrote the amounts, the payees, the current balance, and Helen's messages. Then I added one more line. Find the document that gave her access. I knew exactly which document I meant. 3 months earlier, before I left, I had signed a limited power of attorney for my mother. It was supposed to cover the Colorado condo while I was deployed. Mortgage payments, HOA notices, insurance, emergency repairs if a pipe burst or the roof failed while I was gone. It was not permission to pay for a wedding. I had said that out loud when I signed it. The signing had taken place at my kitchen table on a Tuesday evening. My deployment folder was open beside the document. A list of emergency contacts sat under a pen. Helen had brought a casserole dish because she believed important conversations needed food nearby. I don't want you worrying about the condo, she had said. I won't if the insurance is handled. I'll handle it. Only the property expenses, she had looked hurt. Do you think I would use your money for myself? I think the document should be clear. You always think the document should be clear. Ruth had been the one to answer. That is why documents exist. David had signed as a witness. He did not read the exclusions aloud. He had glanced at the final page and asked whether the bank would accept a scanned copy if something went wrong. At the time, I had taken the question as practical. Now I wondered whether he had been studying the door. Before deployment, I had been proud of the arrangement. I had told myself I was giving Helen a manageable responsibility and keeping my own life moving. I had not wanted to become one of those people who believed being independent meant never letting anyone help. The problem was not that I had accepted help. The problem was that my family treated help as a permanent invitation. My mother had repeated the limits back to me. Now she was telling me not to interfere with another charge. I picked up the phone again and opened the message thread with Helen. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. I wanted to write, "You stole from me." I wanted to ask how she had looked at a $28,000 venue payment and decided it belonged to her. Instead, I typed nothing. I saved the thread and returned to the note. The duty window ended 11 minutes later. I shut down the personal screen, locked the phone, and went back to the shipment discrepancy. For the next hour, I did the work in front of me, while the 3 numbers stayed in the back of my mind, bright and impossible to ignore. When I finally had a private moment, I checked the bank feed again. The pending charge was still there. The balance was still $6,160. And my mother had sent no explanation, only the expectation that I would wait. I slept badly because every time the room settled, I thought the phone had vibrated. At one point, I woke with my hand closed around nothing. The person in the bunk across from mine was already dressed and reading. She glanced over. "Everything okay?" "Family account issue." She nodded as if that explained the particular kind of exhaustion. "Those are the ones that wait until you can't get home." I smiled without meaning to. "Apparently." I did not tell her the amount. I did not tell her that the account issue had a seating chart attached to it. I had learned that deployment created a strange pressure to make every personal problem sound smaller than the work around you. If you said your mother had used your money, people wanted to know whether you were safe. If you said the wrong number had been typed into a shipping document, they knew exactly what to do. I wanted something I could do. I called Nadia Brooks first. She was the military legal assistance contact I had been given during pre-deployment processing, a civilian attorney who worked with service members on ordinary legal problems that became harder to manage from far away. Nadia had helped me review the lease on my apartment and the insurance language on the condo. She knew the difference between a military issue and a civilian issue that happened to occur while I was serving. "Tell me only what you can verify," she said when she answered. "Start with the account and the document." I gave her the amounts. "Are you using a government device?" "No." "Good. Keep the dispute on personal channels. Don't put anything sensitive from your duty work into the banking file, and don't use your position as a reason the bank should move faster." I wasn't planning to. I know. I'm saying it because people panic and start explaining everything. Nadia asked me to read the POA aloud. I had a scanned copy in the deployment folder, between the condo insurance declaration and the emergency contact sheet. The first page identified my mother as an agent for specific property expenses. The second page listed the categories: mortgage, HOA, insurance, emergency repairs connected to the Colorado condo. Any language about gifts? Nadia asked. Excluded. Personal transfers? Excluded. Wedding expenses? Excluded. Does it authorize a general family account? No. She paused. Then keep the dispute narrow. You do not need to prove what your mother intended in order to show what the document allowed. That sentence gave me something solid to stand on. Intent could become a family argument. Scope was printed in black ink. The narrowness sounded like something my mother would have called overcautious. To me, it sounded like relief. Nadia asked me to forward the alerts and the power of attorney. I had scanned the document before leaving and saved it in a folder labeled Condo, Active Documents. I opened it and read it from the beginning, even though I knew the words. Helen was authorized to communicate with the mortgage servicer, HOA, insurer, and repair vendors. She could move funds for those named purposes. She could sign routine property forms. She could not make gifts. She could not transfer money for a family member. She could not change beneficiaries. She could not use the account as a personal or wedding fund. The exclusions are clear, Nadia said after reading it. But the bank may still treat her as an authorized agent for the account while it investigates whether she acted outside the authority you gave her. I asked Nadia whether I had made a mistake by consolidating the accounts. You made a risk decision, she said. That is not the same as making a foolish decision. It feels foolish now. Most risk decisions do, after someone uses the risk against you. She told me that a limited POA could still attach an agent to a whole account while limiting the purposes for which the agent was allowed to act. The bank system was not a moral interpreter. It could process a payment instruction and still leave the agent responsible for the instruction's purpose. The question is whether you can show the difference, she said. I can show the document. Show the document, the account history, the payees, and the communications. Don't rely on your family's character to carry the case. That instruction stayed with me. My family's character was the thing I knew best and trusted least. The document was smaller than the story I had built around it. It had no space for the old arguments, no place to record that Helen had once told me she understood why I needed a home fund. No line for the years I had been the person everyone called when a bill went wrong. It only had limits. Sometimes limits were enough to begin. So the bank can see the document and still say it needs time. Yes. Even though the payees are wedding vendors? That helps your position. It does not turn the bank into a judge on the first phone call. I closed my eyes. The sentence was not what I wanted, but it gave me something more useful than reassurance. It gave me a sequence. Nadia told me to preserve the alerts, the statements, the messages, and any evidence showing what the funds were for. She told me not to accuse Helen of a criminal act in writing. She told me to call the bank's case department and ask for a targeted restriction, not a blanket freeze that could interrupt legitimate condo payments. And revoke the power, she said, today. Can I do that from here? You can sign the revocation. Mara can deliver it stateside. The bank may have its own procedures, so document when you send it and when they confirm the change. Mara Chen was my attorney in the ordinary sense. She had been compliance counsel at the firm where I worked before joining the Army, and she knew how to write a letter that stayed factual when everyone else wanted it to become dramatic. I called her after I ended the conversation with Nadia. Mara answered on the fourth ring. I'm looking at 3 transfers, I said. I saw the screenshots. You already opened them? You emailed them to the records address that forwards to me when you mark something urgent. I didn't mark it urgent. You sent it at 4 in the morning. That counts. For a moment, hearing her ordinary tone made the distance feel smaller. Then she asked, "Do you have the original POA?" "A scan." "Good. I'm going to prepare the revocation and a preservation request. I need the bank statements from the day before the first transfer through today. I also need the exact account title and the transaction references." "The account is mine." "I know. I'm not asking who owns it. I'm asking what the bank calls it, because the authority language will depend on the account record." That was Mara. She made every sentence narrower until it could survive an argument. I called the bank next. Jordan Bell introduced himself as a case specialist. He did not sound surprised that a family member had used a power of attorney. He sounded careful. "I can open an agent-exceeded authority dispute," he said. "I can also place a targeted restriction on outgoing activity from the designated account while we review the document and the transactions. I cannot promise an immediate reversal. The last charge is an ACH payment that hasn't settled. It's reflected in your available balance, but the settlement status is pending. I can flag it. Whether it returns depends on the payment network and the vendor's response. The payees are wedding vendors. Please send the invoices or payment confirmations you have. If you don't have them, send the transaction references and the power of attorney first." He gave me a case number. I wrote it at the top of the same note where I had written the 3 amounts. Agent exceeded authority dispute. The phrase felt different from fraud. Fraud would have made the story simple. A stranger had taken the money. The bank would investigate. The money would come back. I could point at the stranger. This was my mother. She had been authorized to enter the account. The question was what she had been authorized to do once she was inside. Jordan confirmed the restriction would not touch my operating account. He warned me that the condo account might need approved payments routed through Mara until the review was complete. "That means legitimate bills may be delayed," he said. "I understand. I want to be clear. A restriction protects the remaining funds, but it creates an administrative problem." "I understand," I said again. After we ended the call, I sent Mara the POA, the statements, the alert screenshots, and the case number. I sent Nadia a copy of the bank confirmation, keeping the military communications separate from the civilian documents. Then I looked at Helen's last message. "Please don't interfere with the next vendor charge." The words had changed meaning. They were no longer an appeal for patience. They were evidence that my mother expected me to leave the door open. The week before I left, I made 3 lists. The first was for the condo: insurance renewal, HOA contact, emergency plumber, spare key, and the name of the neighbor who agreed to check the utility closet after heavy weather. The second was for the deployment: documents, medical appointments, family contacts, and the small collection of things that make a temporary room feel less temporary. The third was for the home I planned to buy when I came back. That list was not romantic. It had numbers beside it: down payment range, closing cost cushion, 6 months of expenses, a line for repairs, a line for the possibility that my first choice would fall through and I would have to wait another year. I had built the fund because I did not want to return from service and immediately ask anyone in my family where I belonged. I wanted a place with my name on the deed and my decisions on the calendar. Helen called that ambition a little lonely. David called it an unnecessary wall. Evan called it the Sloane system, as if planning for my own life were an odd hobby I would eventually outgrow. I had outgrown other things instead. The account had not begun as a home fund. It had begun as a repair fund. When I bought the condo in Colorado, I kept $10,000 aside for the things people like to call unlikely until they happened: a failed water heater, a broken pipe, an insurance assessment that arrived with a deadline. The rest of the money grew slowly in a high-yield account I named Canyon Reserve, because I liked names that reminded me what a thing was supposed to protect. By the time my deployment orders were confirmed, the balance was $68,000. $58,000 was home savings. $10,000 was the property reserve. I intended to separate them after I returned, once I knew whether I was buying a different place or keeping the condo as a rental. Before I left, though, the bank told me the agent profile on the account could not be split by purpose quickly enough for the property paperwork and my departure date. I accepted the inconvenience because the power of attorney was clear. The bank agent profile was not the same thing as a blank check. I understood that when I signed the form. What I underestimated was how quickly a convenient setup could be translated by my family into a family permission. The account had one owner. The POA had one agent. The categories had names. I had assumed that a document with limits would make the limits obvious to anyone who opened it. That assumption was partly mine to own. I had relied on the paper because I did not want to imagine needing to defend it against the people I had appointed. Before I left, Helen asked whether she could also handle small things if they came up. Small property things, I said. Of course. Not family expenses. She looked offended by the distinction. I know the difference. At the time, I accepted the answer because arguing over a hypothetical felt insulting. I was leaving for 9 months. We were standing in a kitchen surrounded by lists, luggage, and the practical anxiety of a departure. I wanted my mother to help with the condo. I did not want to make her prove she understood the difference between help and control. Ruth understood why I was uneasy. Put the categories in writing, she said. They are in writing. Then keep a copy where you can reach it. I did. The copy traveled with me. What I did not do was separate the money before I left because the bank could not complete the split quickly enough, and because I trusted the document more than I trusted my own discomfort. That was not a secret flaw waiting to be exposed. It was a normal decision made under a deadline. But normal decisions still have consequences when someone else decides the deadline belongs to them too. The night before departure, David stopped by with a folder of wedding sample menus for Evan. He spread the pages across my table while I checked the condo list. The venue is going to be incredible, he said. Who is paying the deposit? He looked at me as if I had asked who is paying for the weather. We're handling it. That means what? It means you should focus on your deployment. I should have asked again. Instead, I folded the condo list and put it in my bag. Months later, the alerts made that conversation look different. Not because David had confessed anything, but because his answer had been designed to end the question rather than answer it. That was the decision I kept returning to. Not because it was foolish, it wasn't. The document named the permitted expenses. My mother had signed beside the restrictions. I had explained them twice, slowly, while Ruth sat at the end of the kitchen table and watched Helen read. This is for the condo, I had said. Helen had adjusted her glasses. Mortgage, HOA, insurance, repairs. Nothing else. Nothing else. Ruth had tapped the page with one finger. Paper limits are not family suggestions, she said. I remembered smiling at her. I know. What I had meant was that I knew the sentence. I knew the legal distinction. I knew that a power of attorney was authority, not ownership. I knew that an agent was supposed to act for the principal and not treat the account as a shared family drawer. What I had not understood was how quickly people who loved you could decide that a limit was an insult. The condo insurance renewal notice arrived on the same morning as the bank alerts. I saw it in the corner of my screen after I finished speaking with Jordan. The annual premium was due in 19 days. The amount was ordinary. The consequence of missing it would not be. That was when I understood what the account restriction would cost me. Protecting the remaining money meant routing legitimate property bills through Mara. It meant checking every payment twice. It meant asking someone else to confirm a basic insurance transaction while I was serving on the other side of the world. I sent the notice to Mara with one sentence. Please add this to the approved property payment list. She answered before I could put the phone down. Already did. The list is short. Keep it that way. I stared at the message and thought about the first time my family had told me I was making something too complicated. It had been at the dinner before I left. Evan arrived late, carrying a sample album from the photography business he had started after college. He put it on the table beside the breadbasket as if it were a centerpiece. "We changed the plan," he said. Leah looked at him, then at me. "Changed is one word for it." The original plan had been a small ceremony at a botanical garden outside Denver. It had a guest list Evan and Leah could manage, and a budget they had discussed openly. I remembered thinking it sounded sensible. I had even offered to help Leah compare 2 photographers, though I had not offered money. Then, Evan's largest commercial client canceled a contract worth $24,000. He told us the cancellation was temporary. His father told us the wedding did not have to become temporary with it. David leaned back in his chair. "We're not going to let one client change the kind of wedding these 2 deserve." "The kind of wedding they deserve?" I asked. "The kind of wedding people remember." He pushed a proof across the table. It was a welcome sign for the venue, printed in dark green letters. At the bottom it said, "Hosted by the Mercer family." David's name wasn't written by itself, but everyone in the family knew who had insisted on the wording. He had already shown the proof to people in his contractor network. He had told them the event was fully funded. The planner's follow-up email was still open on Leah's laptop. David had replied to a question about the second room with one sentence. "Helen has the family funds handled. Please proceed with the expanded layout." There was no account number in the message. No one had written Sloane's name. But it showed David was not merely watching Helen solve a problem after the fact. He was using her assurance to authorize a larger plan before the money had been verified. Evan flipped through the album. "We're adding the second room, the live quartet, and the late-night food service." Leah's smile was tight. "The second room was your father's idea." "It's a good idea." Helen looked at me. "You'll be gone by then." I knew what she meant. The wedding would happen while I was deployed. I would be far away, operating on a schedule that changed without warning, unable to drop everything and stand in the middle of a family argument. "My fund isn't family float," I said. David's mouth tightened. "No one asked you for it." "Good. You always assume the worst." "I assume the amount is not available." Evan laughed once. Not because anything was funny. "Afghanistan will give you perspective." Ruth had been quiet at the far end of the table. She looked at the welcome proof and then at David. "It will give her distance," she said. "Perspective is what people claim when they want someone else to surrender." No one answered her. 2 days later, Helen called about the condo insurance claim. A pipe under the kitchen sink had leaked into the cabinet. The repair was small, but the insurer wanted photographs, a contractor's estimate, and confirmation that someone could sign if the adjuster came while I was away. That was why I signed the POA. Not because my family had earned access. Because I thought a narrow document could create a narrow responsibility. Mara would later tell me that trusting a document was not the same as being careless. But she would also say that a person who has your authority can misuse it even when the paper is clear. At the time, I thought those were 2 separate problems. They were the same problem. The first thing Mara taught me about a disputed payment was that the recipient was not automatically an enemy. If the venue received the money in good faith, they may have obligations of their own, she said. Your objective is to preserve the record and prevent future charges. It is not to make every person who touched the invoice prove their innocence to you. That sounds generous. It's practical. Vendors remember the person who gives them a clean notice. They also remember the person who threatens them before checked the contract. I opened the message I had almost sent to the venue and read it again. It was full of verbs that would have felt satisfying and accomplished nothing. Cancel, return, explain, prove. Mara replaced them with preserve, pause, confirm, and dispute. "Those are boring words," I said. "Boring words survive review." She was right. Mara began with the venue because it was the largest payment and the easiest to identify. She sent a letter on my behalf that did not accuse anyone of theft. It stated that I was the account owner, that the transaction had been made by an agent acting under a limited POA, and that the payment appeared outside the authority granted in that document. She asked the venue to preserve the payment record and not process any additional charges against the account while the dispute was reviewed. The venue's reply came 3 hours later. They confirmed the amount, the date, and the payer account. They confirmed that the payment had been applied to Evan and Leah's event. They did not send the entire contract. They did not need to. They were a business, receiving a dispute from a person who claimed the payment source had been misused. Leah wrote that she had the invoices and payment confirmations, but she did not attach them yet. Her message began with an apology. "I should have asked more questions earlier. I'm trying to understand what they told Evan before I send you everything. I asked her not to send anything she was not comfortable sharing. I told her Mara could preserve the records through a formal request if needed." Leah answered, "I believed your parents were contributing from their own money. Evan said his father had the event covered. I didn't know about your account." I believed her because she did not ask me to forgive anyone. She asked me to tell her what was legitimate. I called the planner. Before we ended the call, I asked Celia whether she had received any unusual instructions when the payments were made. "Unusual how?" "Did my mother say she was acting for a property expense?" "No, she said the funds were from the family." "Did she mention my name?" "She said the family wanted the event handled before anyone changed their mind." The phrase sounded like David. He had always treated hesitation as a defect in other people. If someone asked for a day to read a contract, he said they were making trouble. If someone questioned a cost, he said they lacked confidence. "Did you keep the payment instruction?" I asked. "Yes, I'll send it through the written channel Mara gave me." "Thank you." "I'm sorry this happened." "You didn't do it." "No, but we accepted the payment." "You accepted what you were told was a family contribution. That distinction matters to me." It mattered to me, too. I asked Celia to confirm one more detail: whether the $16,340 bundle had been marked as a final payment or a hold on the date. "It is an installment," she said. "The contract preserves the date if it clears by Friday. If it does not, the venue can release the date after notice. It does not mean the wedding is happening Friday." I repeated that back to make sure I had it right. The correction changed the shape of the urgency. My parents had been speaking as if 5 days were the distance between the family and the wedding itself. It was not. 5 days was the distance between a vendor deadline and the possibility of losing a date that was still 7 months away. "What happens if the date is released?" I asked. "We return to the clients with the available dates. Some deposits may be transferable, some may not be." "And the pending payment?" "If it settles, it is applied according to the contract. If your bank prevents settlement or the account owner disputes it before final retention, we document that separately." Her precision helped. It kept me from making the family's exaggeration my own. I could be angry about the account and still say exactly what the 5-day deadline did and did not mean. I sent the clarification to Mara. She added it to the case file and wrote back with 4 words: "Good. Keep it narrow." That became the rule for every call. The venue had received money. The planner had received money. The bank had processed instructions. None of those facts by themselves answered who had authority to use the money. I did not need to accuse the vendors to establish the boundary. I needed their records, their dates, and their confirmation that the third payment was still pending. When I told Celia the account would be restricted, she did not ask me to explain my family. "We will speak to the named clients," she said. "We will not ask you to negotiate their wedding." That was a small kindness. It let me remain the account owner without becoming the person responsible for rebuilding an event I had never approved. The vendor's willingness to preserve the instruction instead of defending itself gave the bank a cleaner record. It also kept me from turning the person who had processed the payment into another member of my family's argument. She identified herself as Celia and spoke in the careful voice of someone who had been pulled into a family dispute without doing anything wrong. "Mrs. Mercer authorized the $17,500 package," she said. "She signed the payment instruction. We were told it was a family contribution." "Did she say it was my account?" There was a pause. "No, she said the money was available." That sentence landed harder than I expected. Available. Not hers, not mine. Available. "You don't need to refund anything right now," I said. "I'm asking you to pause future charges and preserve the authorization trail." "We can do that. We have a final installment scheduled, but it has not been processed." "Please don't process it." "I can mark the account for review. I can't cancel the event or release the date without the client's instructions." "I'm not asking you to cancel anything." That distinction mattered to me. It was the difference between stopping an improper payment and punishing everyone who had relied on it. After the call, I sent Celia Mara's contact information and asked Mara to preserve the payment instruction. Leah's ledger was still pending. I asked Mara to make sure no vendor was pressured to release a deposit before the records were complete. Then David called. I almost didn't answer. I did because I wanted to know which story he had chosen. "You've created a mess," he said. "I have a bank case. You sent a letter to the venue. Mara sent a preservation request. You know exactly what you're doing." "Yes." He was silent for a moment. "The money was temporary." "That's not an authorization." "It was going to be replaced." "By what?" "Evan's client payment." "The contract he lost?" David exhaled through his nose. "The dispute is not over. Neither is the wedding. You are going to destroy your brother's life because you can't tolerate helping him. I didn't destroy the payment source. You're acting like your mother stole from you. She used my account for a venue, a planner, and a band deposit. She was bridging 5 weeks. There it was. The phrase I would later hear from Helen in a softer voice. I wasn't giving him your money. I was bridging 5 weeks. The problem with a bridge was that it had to lead somewhere. "Give me the repayment date," I said. David didn't answer. That was the first time I understood that the money had not been temporary in the way he meant. It had been temporary only if I agreed not to ask when it was coming back. He ended the call by telling me he had a family to protect. I looked at Leah's 17-page ledger on the screen. The family he meant was the one whose name appeared on the welcome sign, not the person whose account had paid for it. After the call, Celia sent the payment instruction through Mara's secure address. It showed Helen's name, the venue reference, and the words, "Family Contribution," in the notes field. There was no mention of the condo, an emergency repair, or a temporary property expense. Mara asked whether the venue had received any other message from David. Celia forwarded one. David had written that the expanded layout was approved and that the family would take care of the balance as scheduled. He did not name the account. He did not name Sloane. But he had placed his authority behind the assumption that the money was available. I asked Mara to preserve that message without sending it to the family thread. "It shows responsibility," she said. "It does not prove what he knew about the account at that moment." That was the difference I had to keep making. A record could establish what someone approved. It could not automatically establish what they understood. I wanted the case to be strong enough that I did not need to exaggerate it. Evan had always been good at turning uncertainty into a room full of people. When he was 12, he sold raffle tickets for a school trip and came home with twice the amount anyone expected. He had not cheated. He had simply asked every adult in the neighborhood whether they wanted to be the kind of person who helped a child travel. Helen called it charm. David called it leadership. I called it a skill. The problem was that my family treated his skill as a license to make promises before the money existed. Leah was different. She kept a spreadsheet for the wedding because she wanted to know what each decision cost. She had asked Evan whether the second reception room was necessary. He had told her his parents wanted to make the event special. She had not been told that special meant debt. That was why her message about the invoices mattered. She wasn't trying to save a party from embarrassment. She was trying to find the edge of the promise she had been asked to marry into. I understood that better than she knew. Leah had also learned that charm and care were not the same thing. Evan could remember a florist's preferred delivery window, a photographer's favorite coffee, and the exact story behind every table number. He could make a vendor feel seen while postponing the question of whether the invoice had actually been funded. That was why the ledger did more than show amounts. It showed a pattern of decisions made in one room and paid for by people who had not been invited into it. The first page listed the venue deposit, the second listed the planner's initial fee, the third listed a collection of smaller commitments, lighting, table rentals, a rehearsal meal, a cancellation protection charge, and a payment to a string quartet that had not yet played a note. None of the lines taken alone looked like the kind of amount that could break a household. Together, they created a machine that assumed the next payment would always come from somewhere. I knew that machine. My father had built smaller versions of it for years. A repair became a renovation. A favor became an obligation. An obligation became proof that the person who hesitated did not care enough. Evan had inherited the confidence, but not always the pause that should come before a promise. Leah's spreadsheet had a column for funding source. Most of the cells were blank. One row said parents, another said family contribution, and a third said to be confirmed. She had not been careless. She had been receiving reassurance in place of documentation. The distinction mattered because I did not want to turn her into another villain simply because she had trusted the person she was planning to marry. When she called me later, she did not defend the wedding. "I kept asking where the next payment was coming from," she said. "I was told not to worry." "Did you know my account was involved?" "No." "Did Evan?" She paused for so long that I heard the faint scrape of a chair on her side. "I think he knew there was an account," she said. "I don't think he knew it was yours." That became the first clean line between knowledge and assumption. Evan knew his parents were finding money. Leah knew the budget was being carried by a promise. My parents knew which account they had entered. I knew none of that until the alerts arrived. The family had not shared information equally. They had shared only the amount of information needed to keep the next decision moving. Leah opened the spreadsheet while we were still on the call. "Look at this row," she said. "Funding source, parents. I asked twice whether that meant savings, a loan, or a contribution. Evan said his father had arranged it." "Did you ask David directly?" "I asked at the planning meeting. He said the family is behind you." She read the sentence from her notes. Her voice did not rise. That made it sound more serious. "When did the second room become part of the plan?" I asked. "After Evan's contract fell through." "Who approved it?" "David told the venue to hold it. Evan told me it was covered." Leah scrolled through the dates. The venue deposit came first. The planner followed. The catering and rental bundle came after the account had already been reduced. Each new commitment had been made after someone had reason to know the original funding story was unstable. "I should have stopped the expansion," she said. You were asking for the information that would have let you stop it. I kept accepting reassurance because everyone acted like the numbers were settled. That is not the same as knowing the source. She closed the spreadsheet. I'm not going to sign another contract until the money is verified. That was the first decision in the family that did not ask me to absorb the uncertainty. Leah was not promising to save the wedding. She was refusing to build the next version on another unverified account. Evan called during my next communication window. I recognized the number and let it ring once before answering. "Hey," he said. There was music behind him, not wedding music, something electronic and repetitive, probably coming from the studio where he edited photographs. I heard a door close. "Where are you?" I asked. "At work." He sounded too careful. "What did Mom tell you?" Silence. "Why would you ask that?" "Because you called me from work to ask a question you could have sent in a text." He breathed out. "Mom said you were freezing a family account." "There is no family account." "That's not what she said." "What did she say?" "She said you had made a bank issue out of the wedding and that you might interfere with the last payment." "Did she tell you whose money paid the first payments?" Another silence. "She said Dad had it covered." That was not an answer, but it was the answer he had been given. "The venue has a 5-day installment deadline," he said. "Can you wait until then? Just wait 5 days before you do anything else?" "What do you think I've done?" "I don't know. What do you think I'm about to do?" "I don't know that either." "Then why are you asking me to wait?" He rubbed his voice into something defensive. "Because Leah is already upset, Dad is furious, and Mom said you're going to make the venue think the payment is bad." "The payment is disputed. You don't even know what happened." "I know 3 transfers were made from my account to your wedding vendors." The music behind him stopped. "What?" I hadn't planned to tell him that yet. The word came out before I could measure what it would do. "You heard me." "From your account?" "Yes." "My parents' account?" "No." He said nothing. "Evan, I have to go." "Do you know what the money was? I have to go." He ended the call. I stared at the screen. He had not asked how much. He had not asked whether the transfers were authorized. He had asked whether I could wait. That was not guilt. It was not innocence either. It was a person standing near a locked door, hoping nobody would tell him who had the key. A message from Leah arrived 20 minutes later. "Did Evan call you?" I wrote back that he had. "He told me your mother said you were going to freeze something. I asked her what the money was. She said it was family money." Then another message appeared. "I have the invoices. I'm sending them now." The file contained 17 pages. The venue deposit was $28,000. The planner and catering package was $17,500. The $16,340 ACH bundle included lighting, rentals, and the band deposit. Each page had a date, a description, and a payment instruction. None of them mentioned my condo. None of them used language that could be mistaken for insurance, HOA, or emergency repair. At the bottom of the venue ledger, the payer name was the account number ending in 4412. My account. Leah wrote, "I believed your parents were contributing from their own money. I didn't know they were using yours. I'm not asking you to save the wedding. I need to know whether anything else is going to hit the account." I forwarded the ledger to Mara. She replied almost immediately. "This is enough to establish purpose. Don't send the entire file to the family. Let the bank and vendors handle the documents." I wrote back, "Evan says he thought it was their money." Mara answered, "Then don't decide his level of knowledge before he does." That sentence annoyed me because it was fair. The account was not a family argument, it was a record. People could tell the truth or fail to tell it, but the dates would remain. Jordan called later that day. The $16,340 payment is flagged, he said. It has been debited from available balance, but it is still pending settlement. Can the bank stop it? We can place the flag and request a return. The vendor may need to authorize it before the network completes the settlement. So the money is gone and not gone. It has reduced your available balance. It has not reached final settlement. And that matters because the payment can still be returned through the vendor and payment network. It does not mean the bank has decided the transaction was improper. I looked at the pending line on the screen. What do you need from me? Written confirmation that you dispute the agent's authority for the transaction. We have the POA, but I need the vendor purpose and your statement that no condo expense is connected to the payment. I sent the confirmation while we were still on the phone. Jordan said he would add it to the case. Then he asked, "Do you want the designated account restricted now?" The question sounded simple. It wasn't. If I said yes, Helen could not send another payment. The insurance renewal and any legitimate condo expense would need to go through Mara. If I said no, there was nothing to stop another outgoing charge before the bank finished reviewing the POA. I said yes. Targeted restriction only, I told him. Leave the operating account open. Understood. After the call, Leah sent a photograph of the venue seating chart. It was a rough draft, names in small boxes, with a note beside the head table. Mercer family, hosted by David Mercer. I did not know why that small line affected me more than the $61,840. Maybe because money could be reduced to a number. A name on a seating chart was a claim about who mattered. I sent the photograph to Mara, then deleted it from my personal phone after she confirmed she had received it. The pending charge remained on the bank screen. The 5-day clock kept moving. The restriction created a different kind of silence. Before it, the account had been a background promise. Money moved through it for property expenses, savings, and the occasional transfer I made after checking the balance. After it, every legitimate bill became a small operation. Mara created a shared list with 3 columns: property purpose, amount, and supporting document. The condo insurance renewal went first. The HOA assessment went second. A maintenance company sent an estimate for a water heater inspection, and Mara asked whether it was urgent or merely convenient. Urgent enough to affect the insurance? I asked. Not according to the estimate. Then it waits. That was not how I wanted to spend a deployment communication window. I wanted the account protected without every ordinary decision reminding me that my family had made protection necessary. Mara noticed the pause. You can be angry and still approve the insurance payment, she said. I know. You can also refuse the water heater inspection until the estimate is clearer. A boundary isn't a tantrum, it's a sorting system. I added the phrase to the note. Sort the requests. Don't let the emergency become everything. The lesson was not elegant. It was useful. There was administrative work behind every sentence in that boundary. Jordan needed the exact account number, the date the POA had been signed, the date the revocation became effective, and a list of the transactions I disputed. Mara needed copies that could be read without the bank portal. I had to download statements during a connection window, rename files, and send them before the system timed out. The work made the anger less cinematic. There was no dramatic button marked "Protect Everything." There was a reference number, a 10-minute call, a PDF that would not attach, and a second attempt after my device restarted. The account did not become safe because I felt betrayed. It became safer because each necessary action was completed and recorded. I kept a running note beside my duty schedule. 0900, statement downloaded. 0917, revocation signed. 0934, Jordan confirms restriction request. 951, Mara requests vendor evidence. The note looked like an ordinary logistics checklist. That was the part of me that could still function. In Afghanistan, a missing serial number could delay a shipment, and a delay could become a shortage 2 steps later. At home, a vague promise had already done the same thing to money. The scale was different. The discipline was not. I told Nadia that I had a family financial problem, without giving her details. "Do you need a private communication window?" she asked. "I need to stay useful during the one I have." "Then separate the tasks. 10 minutes for the bank, 10 minutes for the family. Nothing gets the entire window." It was simple advice, but it stopped the dispute from swallowing the rest of my life. I wrote the bank questions first, then the property questions, then the family messages. I did not answer anything that demanded a feeling before it supplied a fact. Helen hated that change. She sent 3 messages in one day, each shorter than the last. "Call me. You need to hear me. This is getting out of control." I saved them with the same care I used for the invoices. Not because every message was evidence of a crime, but because the sequence showed the pressure around the account. The more I asked for dates and amounts, the more she asked me to return to emotion. That was how I knew the process was working. It was narrowing the argument to something that could be checked. The restriction went into effect before my next sleep cycle. Jordan sent a confirmation with a reference number and a warning that the designated account could no longer process ordinary outgoing activity without review. He listed the approved property categories: mortgage, HOA, insurance, emergency repair. He did not list wedding. That absence was the whole case. Mara prepared the revocation. She sent it to me for electronic signature, then sent the signed version to the bank and to Helen's email. The subject line was plain: revocation of limited power of attorney, Sloane Mercer. The letter did not contain the word stolen. It said that Helen's authority was revoked effective immediately, that the bank should prevent further agent activity, and that all records related to transactions initiated under the POA should be preserved. I read it 3 times before signing. The first time, I felt embarrassed. The second time, I felt angry. The third time, I noticed that the letter did not ask my mother to admit anything. It did not need her agreement to become true. Helen called after receiving it.
"You had no right to send that without talking to me."
"We talked. You know what I mean. I'm not discussing the revocation by phone. You're in another country, and you're making legal decisions about a family event. I'm making a banking decision about my account. You're going to ruin Evan's wedding. The wedding date is 7 months away. The installment is due in 5 days. Then there are 5 days for the people who promised the money to replace it." She went quiet. "You've changed," she said. "No, you're seeing the part of me you never had access to." That made her cry. I could hear it in the soft break between breaths. I had heard that sound when I was a child, usually after my father had left the room. It had once made me apologize before I knew what I had done. "I wasn't giving him your money," she said. "I was bridging 5 weeks." "With what repayment source?" "The photography contract." "The contract that was canceled?" "It's being disputed." "When will it pay?" "I don't know." There it was again. No date, no written promise, no money moving toward the account, only the assumption that I would be patient because patience had always been cheaper for them than asking Evan to make a sacrifice. "I need you to understand," Helen said. "Your brother was already committed. Then he had a commitment. You're acting like he did something to you. He used a service he couldn't pay for. He didn't know. You did." She inhaled sharply. I ended the call before the conversation could become an argument about whether she had intended to hurt me. Intent mattered. It just didn't erase the transfer. Mara routed the condo insurance renewal through the operating account and sent the payment confirmation to the bank. That was the first practical cost of the restriction. A bill that should have taken 2 clicks took 3 people, 2 emails, and a case reference. I added it to my note. Protecting the fund creates paperwork. Accept the cost. Later that day, the venue responded to Mara. The next contractual installment was due in 5 days. If it was not replaced or covered by a new payment plan, the venue would release the original date. The deposit already paid would remain subject to the contract terms. The venue would not publicly announce anything. It would not call the family dishonest. It would simply stop holding a date without verified funds. That was how ordinary consequences happened. No music stopped. No crowd turned around. Someone looked at a contract and decided a promise was no longer enough. David called me after Mara forwarded the venue's letter. "You've made them nervous," he said. "They're protecting their calendar. They're holding the date for my family. They're holding it for a payment. You don't understand what this does to us." "I understand exactly what it does. It makes you responsible for the money you promised." He said I was choosing a bank over my brother. I looked at the 3 debits on my screen. "No," I said. "I'm choosing my account over your promise." He ended the call. For the first time since the alerts arrived, I felt the ground under the story change. The wedding was not collapsing. It was being asked to stand on its own. That distinction mattered because the family had been using the word ruin to describe any version of the wedding that required a real budget. The venue was not canceling the marriage. The planner was not forbidding the ceremony. The date might be released if the installment was not replaced, and some deposits might be lost or renegotiated. Those were serious consequences, but they were not the same as the end of Evan and Leah's future. I wrote the facts in a separate note so I would not confuse them with the messages coming from home. Wedding date, 7 months away. Vendor deadline, 5 days. Pending ACH, $16,340, not yet finally settled. Account balance after alerts, $6,160. Authorized property bills, still payable through review. The list looked cold. It also gave me back the ability to think. Nadia reviewed the wording of my next message before I sent it to the venue. She did not edit my anger. She removed the parts that made the venue responsible for my family's decisions. "Tell them the payment source is disputed," she said. "Tell them you want the record preserved. Do not tell them what the couple should do with their wedding." I sent the message through Mara. The venue replied that it would hold communication with the named clients and their authorized planner. It would not draw another payment from the restricted account. It would provide a written decision about the date if the installment remained unpaid. That was all I needed from them. The rest belonged to Evan, Leah, and the parents who had promised the money. The next morning, Mara sent me the insurance confirmation. The payment had gone through the operating account, not the restricted reserve. She attached the approval note from Jordan and a copy of the insurer's receipt. "Property expense verified. No wedding funds used." I read the sentence twice. It was a tiny success, but it showed me what the new system looked like. A legitimate bill could still be paid. It simply had to arrive with a purpose, a document, and a person willing to sign for the decision. The water heater estimate came later that week. The maintenance company wanted to inspect the unit before the next cold snap. Mara asked whether the inspection was an emergency under the POA or a precaution that could wait. I asked the property manager for a written risk assessment. He sent one explaining that the unit was functioning, the leak sensors were dry, and a delay of 30 days would not affect coverage. "Postpone it," I told Mara. "That is the right call if you can live with the inconvenience." I could. The point was not to freeze the condo. The point was to stop letting every ordinary request become an excuse for family access. For the first time, I saw why the account had needed 2 layers. The operating account handled the life of the condo. The reserve protected the possibility of my next life. My parents had treated the layers as one because the bank profile had made them look like one. I had to separate them in practice before I could separate them in the account. The message stayed open on my screen for 23 minutes. I kept editing the subject line. Documentation of disputed wedding transfers became account activity during deployment, then please review before the next payment. Each version sounded less like a daughter asking to be believed and more like a notice from a person who had already decided what everyone else deserved to know. I wondered whether that was strength or simply another way of controlling the room. The difference mattered because I had spent most of my life watching my father control a room by announcing the conclusion first. He would say the contractor had failed, the budget was unreasonable, or Evan had been misunderstood. Then everyone else would spend the evening proving him right by reacting to the frame he had chosen. I did not want to become the person who sent the frame before anyone could ask a question. I wanted the record to arrive before the argument. I drafted the message at the end of a duty window. It began with the power of attorney and ended with the 3 invoices. In between, I wrote the amounts, the account number, the date of each transfer, and the sentence my mother had sent me. Please don't interfere with the next vendor charge. The family thread included my parents, Evan, Leah, 2 aunts, and the cousins who treated every wedding update as public information. If I pressed send, everyone would know before the bank finished reviewing the case. For a few minutes I imagined the messages arriving. My aunt would ask whether this was really necessary. My father would say I had weaponized a private matter. My mother would say she had only been trying to help. Someone would forward the invoices to the venue. Someone else would call Leah. The wedding party would be forced to explain a financial dispute they had not created. I looked at the draft again. The facts were true. That did not mean sending them to everyone was the right next action. Leah called before I decided. I saw the file, she said. Which file? The message you're about to send. I had not sent it. How do you know? Evan showed me the draft. For a moment, I felt something sharp and unreasonable. He had been looking at my words before I had decided what they were. He shouldn't have. Probably not. Are you calling to tell me not to send it? I'm calling to tell you what will happen if you do. I waited. The venue will freeze communication with everyone except the named clients. The planner will probably stop making decisions. The band may release the date because they won't want to be pulled into a payment dispute. None of that gets your money back faster. It makes the truth visible. The truth is already visible in the ledger. She said it without anger. That was what made it hard to argue with her. I don't want you to protect my parents, I said. I'm not asking you to. Then what are you asking? Don't use the vendors as the punishment. They didn't take the money. I looked at the message again. If I don't send it, they get to keep telling people I'm the problem. Not if the bank has the documents. Not if the vendors have written notice. Not if Evan has to read the invoices himself. He won't. Then send them to him privately. Leah had a way of making an action smaller without making it weaker. I deleted the family thread from the recipients. Then I deleted the wedding party. I kept Evan and my parents, but even that felt too broad. I saved the message as a draft instead. I'm not sending anything tonight, I said. Good. That doesn't mean I'm paying. I know. It doesn't mean the wedding stays on schedule. I know that too. After we ended the call, I sent Mara one sentence. Use the full vendor ledger in the bank dispute. Leah has authorized it. Do not distribute it to the family. That was my decision. Not forgiveness, not protection of my parents' reputation, protection of the people who had trusted a payment instruction without knowing where it came from. It also meant giving up the easiest pressure tactic. If I had exposed Helen and David to everyone, the wedding would have become a public event before the bank had even decided whether it could recover anything. I would have been able to say I had told the truth, but I might still have had to wait for the money. I chose the slower path. The slower path required me to tolerate being misunderstood for longer. That was harder than I expected. Public exposure offers an immediate reward. The person who has been controlling the story loses control of the audience. Everyone sees the document at once. Everyone has to react to the same facts. For a few minutes, the sender feels less alone. But the family thread was not a courtroom. It was a crowd. Crowds do not always produce accountability. Sometimes they produce competing versions of the event, side conversations, screenshots, and people choosing the explanation that lets them keep their place at the table. I opened a second document and made 2 columns. What public exposure could do. Stop the next family request. Prevent my parents from describing the money as a gift. Warn relatives not to contribute to the wedding under false assumptions. What public exposure could damage. Vendor negotiations, Leah's privacy, the bank's ability to receive a clean packet, and any chance Evan would look at the ledger before defending the story he had been given. The second column was longer. Leah stayed on the call while I read it aloud. "You don't have to protect us from embarrassment," she said. "But if you send it because it serves the case, not because they deserve to feel what you felt." I disliked the sentence because it was fair. "What would you do?" I asked. "I would send the bank the full ledger. I would tell the venue the disputed funds are being addressed. I would tell Evan he cannot sign a replacement contract until he knows the source of the deposit. Then I would stop explaining myself to people who are not paying anything." That gave me a sequence. I removed the aunts and cousins from the draft. I moved the bank packet to the top of my task list. I attached the vendor ledger to Mara's secure email instead of forwarding it through the family thread. I wrote Evan one message that contained no accusation. "The money came from my account. The POA did not authorize wedding spending. Please do not sign a replacement contract until the funding source is verified." He answered after 40 minutes. "I didn't know." I believed that he had not known the account was mine. I did not yet know whether he had suspected the money was borrowed, redirected, or simply available. That uncertainty was not a reason to fill the gap with an assumption. I saved the unsent family message as a record of what I had wanted to do. Then I closed it. The next day, Leah sent the complete ledger to Mara through the secure address Mara had provided. It included the venue contract, the planner's agreement, the catering schedule, the lighting rental, and the band deposit. The documents showed something the first bank alerts could not. The transfers were not one desperate payment. They were a series of deliberate commitments made to keep an expanded wedding moving. Mara sent the ledger to Jordan with a note explaining that Leah had authorized its use. Jordan replied that the file had been added to the case. Then he called Evan. I learned that from Leah, not because I could see what was happening at home. "He read the invoices," she told me. "All of them?" I made him sit down. "What did he say?" "At first, he said your parents had savings." "And then?" "Then he saw the account number." I didn't ask what his face looked like. I didn't want a description of an expression I had not witnessed. "He knew they were finding money," Leah said. "He didn't know they were finding yours. That distinction is going to matter to him. It already does." Evan called me that evening. This didn't begin with a request. "I didn't know," he said. I waited. I knew Mom and Dad were covering the extra costs. I knew my contract had fallen through. I knew Dad said the wedding was paid for. I didn't know they had used your account. "Did you ask?" "No." "Why not?" He took a breath. "Because I thought it was their money." "You thought they had an extra $60,000? "I didn't know how much it was." "You didn't think to ask?" "You're right." The words were so unfamiliar from him that I almost interrupted. "I'm not asking you to agree with me," I said. "I'm not agreeing because you're deployed." "Good. I'm agreeing because I saw the invoices." That was the first honest thing he had said to me in years. He told me he had called the venue and canceled the pending vendor bundle. The venue would release the original date if the installment was not replaced. He and Leah were discussing a smaller event and a postponement. "Dad will never accept that," he said. "Then he can fund the original event. He says the host materials are already printed. Paper is cheaper than repayment." Evan let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "You really are doing this from Afghanistan?" "I'm doing it from my account." "I'm sorry, the apology was too early and too small. I could hear that he meant it, but meaning was not the same as repairing." "Don't apologize for what you didn't know," I said. "Decide what you do now that you do know." He said he would. The venue released the original date 4 days later. I learned through the written notice Mara forwarded to me. The $28,000 deposit remained subject to the contract. The venue did not call the payment fraudulent. It did not blame Evan or Leah. It stated that the date could no longer be held without a replacement installment and a new signed agreement. That was the consequence, not humiliation, an empty date on a calendar. The 6 months between the released wedding date and my return did not pass cleanly. The bank asked for clarification twice because the first account statement showed the payment descriptions in abbreviated form. Mara sent the full ledger. Jordan asked for the payment instructions. Leah sent the vendor confirmations again. Each request felt like a small test of whether the story would remain coherent when a person who had not lived it looked at the pages. That was the point of the pages. They had to make sense without my voice. Helen tried to make the story personal. In one email, she wrote that she had been unable to sleep because I had turned a family favor into a legal case. In another, she wrote that the wedding was no longer the same and that everyone blamed me for the change. I saved both emails. I did not answer them. David preferred short messages. "You are making this impossible. Evan has already lost the date. Your grandmother is worried." Ruth's message was the only one that did not ask me to fix the feeling it described. "I am worried about the people who keep asking you to carry what they chose." I read it on a morning when the signal was poor and saved it before the screen went dark. The new wedding plan was smaller. Evan and Leah had not chosen a final date. They were waiting for the bank review and the repayment discussion because Leah refused to sign another vendor contract until the payment source was clear. When my rotation ended, I flew home with one bag, one folder, and a phone full of messages I had not answered. My parents had arranged a welcome dinner at Ruth's house. It was not the original wedding venue. There was no quartet, no printed host wall, and no room full of people watching to see whether I would forgive them. There were 6 place settings. Ruth had put the ledger on the table before I arrived. Helen stood when I entered. David stayed seated. Evan and Leah were beside the window. Ruth had not prepared a reconciliation dinner. She had prepared a room where no one could hide behind a schedule. The chairs were close enough that a person had to look at the other people while speaking. There was no television in the background, no second room where someone could take a call and return with a revised version of the conversation. She placed water beside every plate and left the coffee pot in the kitchen. "No one needs to be kept awake by caffeine," she said. David almost smiled. Helen did not. I opened the folder. The first page was the account statement. The next was the signed POA. Then the 3 vendor confirmations, the bank call note, the revocation, and the correspondence showing when the vendor had returned the pending payment. "I'm not here to make you agree with my feelings," I said. "I'm here to make sure we use the same numbers." David touched the first page. "You've turned your homecoming into an audit." "The audit started when the alerts arrived. The dinner is where we read it together." Evan looked at the stack. "I should have asked more questions." Leah put her hand over his, but she did not interrupt. Helen said, "You all act like I hid a stranger's money." "You used my money without permission," I said. "The fact that we share a last name does not change whose account it was." "I thought you wanted the wedding to happen." Wanting something to happen is not the same as authorizing every cost. Ruth looked at David. What did you know? He shifted in his chair. I knew Helen was handling the payments. David had already told the planner the family funds were handled. Did you know the payments came from Sloane's account? Not when the first vendor was paid. When did you know? He looked at Helen before answering. When the bank asked for the transaction records, Helen showed me the alert. I saw your account name. Then you knew it was mine. I knew it was your account, and you still called it family money. He looked at the ledger. I thought we could replace it before you came home. That answer mattered, not because it excused him, but because it fixed the moment when uncertainty ended. After that moment, the family did not simply lack information. They had information and chose a story that required me to stay quiet. Leah turned the ledger toward Evan. Read the vendor names, she said. He did. Venue, planner, caterer, quartet, rentals. He stopped at the total. 61,840. That is what has to be accounted for, I said. Not emotionally, on paper. The room became quiet in a different way. It was no longer waiting for me to forgive them. It was waiting to see whether the adults who had made the commitments could make a plan that did not depend on another person's silence. Mara had told me the strongest evidence would be the evidence no one expected to see. Jordan had sent it 2 weeks before I came home. I took out the bank call note. There is one more record, I said. Helen's hands tightened. I noticed because Ruth noticed too. Before the first transfer, I continued, you called the bank. Helen looked at David. You asked whether an agent could send third-party payments from the designated account. The bank processed the request. The note says the agent remained responsible for acting within the POA. David's face changed. Not dramatically. The muscles around his mouth simply stopped pretending the conversation was about confusion. That note doesn't say what I asked, Helen said. It says what the bank recorded. I was asking about a payment. You were asking whether the bank would process it. I thought if the bank allowed it, the bank allowing a transaction to process is not the same as giving you permission to make it. The room went quiet. That sentence belonged to Nadia, but I had carried it all the way home. Helen looked down at the paper. I wasn't giving him your money, she said. I was bridging 5 weeks. With no contract, no repayment date, and no money set aside to replace it. She started to cry. This time, I did not apologize. Evan looked at her. You told me it was family money. Helen wiped her face. I told you your father had arranged it. That isn't what I asked. David said his name sharply. Don't turn on your mother. Evan looked at him. I'm not turning on anyone. I'm asking who paid. Leah reached across the table and put her hand over Evan's wrist. We need to decide what we can afford now, she said. Ruth finally looked at Helen. And what you owe. Helen whispered, We were going to repay her. That is not a repayment plan, Ruth said. No one argued with her, not even David. David reached for the welcome proof that had been printed months earlier. He had brought it to the dinner folded inside the same envelope as the venue release notice, as if the words at the bottom could still explain the money at the top. I put my name on the event, he said. That is not the same as taking your account. You told the planner the family funds were handled. I believed they would be. After Helen showed you the alert? He looked at the proof. After that, I believed we had time. You had 5 days to replace one installment. You had months to tell me the source was mine. You were deployed. That is why you thought you could keep the story moving. Evan looked from the host proof to his father. Did you tell the vendors it was covered because you knew it was covered, or because you knew someone would be pressured to cover it? David's face hardened. Watch how you speak to me. I'm asking what I'm responsible for. Leah did not soften the question. And what I'm supposed to sign next, she added. The welcome proof stayed on the table. The phrase, hosted by the Mercer family, looked less like pride now and more like a promise David had made in public before he had verified the private cost. Ruth turned to me. What do you want from this table? The question stopped the room more effectively than any accusation. I want the money accounted for, I said. I want the remaining property bills handled without family access. I want Evan and Leah to know exactly what funded the wedding. And I want any repayment plan written before anyone asks me to move on. Helen looked at the ledger. You want us to sign something. I want the promise to have a date. David folded the welcome proof in half. We can discuss the amount. The amount is already in the account history. No one had a better number. That was the first honest agreement in the room. For once, the silence did not ask me to fill it. It asked the people who made the promise to decide what they could actually carry. The bank's answer would determine what could be recovered. It would not determine whether the family had to take responsibility. That distinction stayed with me through the next 2 days of waiting. I kept my phone face down, but I did not stop checking the case folder. The next answer would be written, dated, and separate from every apology. That was the only kind of answer I could carry home. It was enough to wait for. And document. Jordan sent the bank's decision to Mara 2 days after the dinner. Mara printed it before she came to Ruth's house. The first point, she said, is the vendor return. She placed a confirmation on the table. The $16,340 ACH payment had been returned before final retention. The vendor had not been required to decide whether Helen acted lawfully. It had simply agreed that the payment should not remain in place while the source was disputed. That restored the first piece of the balance. The second point was more complicated. After 41 days of reviewing the POA, the call note, the payment destinations, the vendor records, and the account history, the bank offered a partial recovery of $20,000 from the settled payments. Why only 20? David asked. Jordan answered through Mara, who had already explained the wording to me. Helen had been an authorized agent on the account. The bank had processed the instructions. The POA exclusions strengthened my position. But the bank was not accepting responsibility for the entire amount simply because the payments had gone to wedding vendors. The bank would return $20,000 as a partial recovery after its review. The remaining $25,500 was not covered by the bank's decision. David shook his head. That's not fair. It's a bank outcome, Mara said. It is not a statement that the remaining amount belongs to you. Helen looked at me. We can pay it back. How? She started to speak, then stopped. Evan did not look at either of them. I can sell the backup camera package, he said. Leah turned toward him. The one you use for overflow jobs? The backup body and the long lens, not the primary kit. That won't cover everything. It will cover $8,000. He said it as if he had already checked. I checked the resale value, he added. I can sell it this week. That was the first time he spoke as the person responsible for a decision, instead of the person standing inside a family explanation. Mara took out a sheet of paper. Here is the proposed ledger. She wrote the amounts in 5 lines. Vendor refund, $16,340. Bank partial recovery, $20,000. Evan reimbursement, $8,000. Parents' payment at signing, $5,000. Parents' scheduled balance, $12,500. She turned the page toward me. That totals $61,840, she said. The bank recovery and vendor refund are not counted twice. The parents' schedule is the remaining amount after the other recoveries and Evan's payment. I checked the calculation myself. 1634. 20,000, 8,000, 5,000, 12,500, 61,84. The same number that had appeared on my phone at 3:17 in the morning. The number looked different on paper. Not smaller, just finished. For months, the number had been an accusation without a place to land. It appeared in the bank alert, in Jordan's case file, in the vendor correspondence, and in my private notes. Each time it moved through a different system, someone asked me to explain why it mattered. At the table, the total finally had owners attached to it. The vendor had returned what had not finally settled. The bank had recovered part of what had settled. Evan had chosen an asset to sell. My parents had agreed to a payment and a schedule. None of those actions erased the original decision. They made the consequences visible enough to manage. I asked Mara whether a signed schedule could be changed later. "Any agreement can be changed if the people who signed it agree," she said. "That does not mean you have to change it because someone becomes uncomfortable." I wrote the dates in a separate calendar. I added a reminder 3 days before each installment, not because I wanted to monitor my parents, but because I no longer wanted important facts to depend on a message arriving after a deadline. David called the schedule humiliating. "A bank review already made us look like criminals," he said. "The schedule does not call you anything. It says what you owe and when it is due. You could trust us. Trust is not a substitute for a date." He did not answer. That silence was not reconciliation. It was the first moment when there was no softer story available that could change the amount. "The parent schedule needs dates," I said. David's face tightened. "We are sitting here agreeing to pay you. You are sitting here discussing terms. You don't trust us. You used an account you were not permitted to use. Your mother made a mistake. Your mother made 3 transfers." Helen closed her eyes. "I know." Mara slid a second page across the table. It listed 12 monthly payments, with the first 5,000 due that day, and the remaining 12,500 divided into 11 installments. Any later bank recovery would reduce the parent's schedule balance, not become a second payment to me. "And my dispute costs?" I asked. "Separate," Mara said. "They've agreed to cover the documented fees." "Not from the $61,840? Not from the principal recovery ledger?" I appreciated the distinction. Money was easier to trust when every line had one job. Helen signed first. Her signature was smaller than I remembered. David held the pen for a long time. "If I sign this," he said, "you're going to tell everyone we stole from you." "I'm not sending the family message." "That's not what I asked. I'm not going to lie if someone asks me what happened." He looked at Ruth. Ruth said, "Then he should have considered that before he printed his name on the host sign." David signed. Evan signed his reimbursement acknowledgement after sending the first confirmation from the resale shop. He had not sold the equipment yet, but the buyer had agreed to the amount and scheduled the transfer. Leah signed a separate page acknowledging the wedding changes. She did not sign the parents' debt. She did not accept responsibility for the payments. She did not ask me to call the venue and restore the old date. "We're going to choose a smaller ceremony," she said. David looked at her. "You're going to let this ruin the wedding?" "No," she said. "We're going to stop pretending we can afford a different wedding." Evan nodded. "The big event was built on money that wasn't ours." "It was a family contribution," David said. "It was my sister's money." The room changed after that. Evan had not shouted. He had not insulted anyone. He had simply stopped using the family's preferred noun. Not contribution. Money. My money. David stood and walked to the window. Outside, the late afternoon had turned the street the color of dust. He could see the empty space where the wedding welcome sign had been meant to stand, though the sign had never been installed. "People will ask why the date changed," he said. "Tell them the truth," Evan said. You have no idea what that will do to the family.
I know what the other version did to Sloane.
David turned around. For a second I thought he might finally apologize. Instead, he asked me whether I felt better. I considered the question. The bank had recovered part of the money. The vendor had returned the pending payment. Evan had accepted a cost. My parents had signed a repayment schedule. None of those things made the original alerts disappear. I feel clear, I said. That was the closest answer I had. Before the smaller ceremony, I visited the condo. The insurance payment had gone through. The HOA account was current. The water heater inspection had been postponed because Mara and I had decided it was maintenance, not an emergency. Nothing in the rooms looked different, but I knew exactly how vulnerable the place had been while I was away. The new property reserve account had a different name and no family agent. I had separated it from the home savings and set up alerts that arrived on more than one device. The changes were boring. They were also mine. I also changed the way I said yes. Before the deployment, I had treated a limited POA as a practical shortcut. If my parents could pay the condo insurance, I did not need to be reachable for every routine bill. If the account carried a reserve, I did not need to move money between accounts every time I changed duty locations. The convenience had been real. So had the risk I had accepted without naming it. Afterward, every request had to identify the purpose before it reached the money. Can you cover this was not enough. The answer had to include what the expense was, who owed it, when it was due, and what happened if it was not paid. That structure did not make me cold, it made my consent visible. I kept the repayment schedule in the same folder as the POA, but I did not keep it in the same emotional category. The POA was closed, the schedule was active. One was a boundary, the other was a consequence that would take time. The first $5,000 payment arrived on the agreed date. David sent the confirmation. Helen added a message asking whether that meant I was ready to move on. I answered, "It means the first payment arrived. The boundary remains." She did not reply. The smaller ceremony would give the family a new photograph, but it would not erase the old ledger. Leah kept a copy because she wanted the wedding records to match the money that funded them. Evan kept the receipt from the camera sale. My parents kept the schedule, signed at the bottom, with dates that could be checked without a family meeting. I kept the bank call note. Not as a weapon, as a reminder that clarity often arrives before comfort does. The note showed that my mother had asked the right processing question and then crossed the wrong boundary. It showed that the bank could be imperfect without making my mother innocent. It showed that a document could protect me only if I was willing to use it when using it changed the shape of the family. Duty had taught me to track what moved, what stopped, and what still needed a handoff. The account dispute taught me that people were part of the same system. If I did not define responsibility, someone else would define it for me. If I did not put a limit on access, love would be used as the explanation for every exception. The account was no longer a place where my family could reach me indirectly. It was simply mine. That sentence was not a victory speech. It was an operating rule. The house fund could grow again, the condo could remain, or it could be sold. My parents could earn back trust in ordinary ways, or they could choose distance. I did not have to decide all of that on the day the money became a crisis. I only had to stop confusing access with love and a promise with permission. The rest could be handled one verified step at a time, which was the only pace I trusted anymore. It was slower than family pressure, slower than a wedding countdown, and slower than the answer I had wanted from the bank. It was also stable enough to build on. That was enough for the next morning, and enough for me to keep going without pretending the damage had already disappeared. The account was protected, but recovery would take time. I stood in the kitchen where the POA had been signed and opened the folder containing the repayment schedule. The table still had the faint ring from Ruth's blue mug. I thought about how easily the story could have ended with a public accusation. I could have sent the invoices to everyone. I could have shown the banknote to the wedding party. I could have made David explain his host sign before the event was even rescheduled. The fact that I chose not to did not make me generous. It meant I had decided what kind of consequence I could live with. The smaller ceremony took place 8 weeks after I returned. There was no large venue, no printed host wall, no live quartet. Leah chose a restaurant with a courtyard, and Evan paid the deposit from an account that did not belong to me. I attended because Leah invited me directly. My parents were there because Evan invited them with one condition. They could not discuss the repayment at the table. They agreed. For 90 minutes, the family acted like a family that had not just spent 6 months arguing over the difference between access and permission. Then the dinner ended, and the acting ended with it. Helen asked to see me alone. We stood near the restaurant's side entrance, where the sound of dishes being stacked came through the open door. "I'm sorry," she said. I waited. "I should never have used the account." "That is the factual part." She looked at me. "There's another part?" "There's the part where you stop asking for access." Her face tightened. "I'm your mother. That is why the boundary has to be clear. You think I'm going to do this again? I think I'm not going to build my safety around the hope that you won't." She looked down at her hands. "I was trying to help Evan." "You were trying to keep him from experiencing the result of a promise he couldn't afford." "He was scared." "So was I." She started to say that I had been away, that she had not known how to reach me, that the wedding had become larger than anyone expected. I let her say those things. They were explanations, not permission. When she finished, I told her the new rule. "You can be in my life," I said. "You cannot have financial authority over it. No POA, no emergency access, no surprise obligation routed through Evan. If you need something from me, you ask me directly and accept the answer." "And if the answer is no?" "Then it's no." She nodded, though she did not look like she accepted it. Acceptance was not required for a boundary to work. The same rule applied to the rest of the family. I did not need a unanimous vote before protecting the account. Leah did not need my parents' approval before asking for a clear wedding budget. Evan did not need permission to sell his equipment and take responsibility for the part of the promise he had accepted. A boundary was not a punishment delivered to make everyone agree with my version of the past. It was a condition for what could happen next. We could speak. We could attend the same dinner. We could celebrate a smaller ceremony. None of that reopened the account or restored the POA. When I left Ruth's house that night, the folder felt lighter because it had a plan inside it. The money was not fully back yet. The family was not repaired. But the next action did not belong to an argument. It belonged to a date, a transfer, or a document. David never asked for a private conversation. He sent one message after the first repayment cleared. "You could have handled this differently." I answered once. "So could you." Then I archived the thread. The bank credited the $20,000 partial recovery after the review. The vendor refund had already restored the $16,340. Evan's $8,000 arrived after he sold the backup camera and lens package. My parents' first $5,000 payment cleared the day they signed. The remaining $12,500 sat on the repayment schedule, divided across the next 11 months. The account was no longer a story about what might happen. It was a ledger. I changed every access setting. I updated the beneficiaries. I opened a separate property reserve account with no family agent attached. The home fund was still smaller than it had been, and the house search could wait. I had spent years thinking the home fund represented a place I would eventually buy. After the theft, it represented something else, too. It represented the part of my future I was no longer willing to leave unguarded just because the people asking for the key knew my birthday. When I returned to duty, planning for my next assignment, I kept the signed repayment schedule in the same folder as the revoked POA. I did not keep it there because I wanted to punish anyone. I kept it there because both documents described the same lesson from different directions. The POA showed what I had allowed someone to do. The repayment schedule showed what I required after they exceeded it. Distance had not made me harder. It had made the family's assumptions easier to see. They had assumed that because I was serving far away, I could be used without being present. They had assumed that because I was disciplined, I would absorb the cost quietly. They had assumed that because I loved them, I would confuse access with love. I had made one assumption too. I had believed that a signed limit would be respected simply because it was written down. Now I understood the difference between a boundary and a document describing a boundary. The document could prove what I had said. The boundary was what I did next. I did not send the family message. I did not destroy the vendors. I did not pay for a wedding that was never mine to fund. I recovered what could be recovered. I accepted the cost of what took time. I let Evan decide what kind of brother he wanted to be after the invoices were visible. I let my mother apologize without giving her the account back. And I left the ledger closed.